Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Parker. I am so thrilled today to have with me on the show Sheri Winston. She is the author of a book called Women's Anatomy of Arousal, Secret Maps to Buried Pleasure. Fantastic title and fantastic book that I've been delving into this last week because I knew that I was going to be interviewing her. So before we get started, I just want to give a few announcements. I will be in Houston the weekend of July 13th for a Mormon Stories retreat for anybody who's interested in attending that. I also will be presenting at Sunstone at the end of July, and we have been offered 2 free tickets for me to just kind of offer to subscribers. So I'm just going to be pulling names out of a hat and seeing if anybody's interested in attending that. So that's kind of exciting. And then my next retreats will be in October for Mormon Matters. And some different things that I'll be doing with Stephanie Bueller in California for those of you who are interested in sex therapy training, etc. All of that information can be found on my website, natashaparker.org. For those of you who are subscribers to the Mormon Sex Info podcast, thank you so much for your support. It really matters for me to be able to continue to spend my time and energy offering these, what I think are phenomenal interviews with pretty phenomenal people. So thanks for all of that. Sheri, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being with me today. And before we get started too much, I'd like for you to just have an opportunity to introduce yourself. Tell us about yourself, your background. How did you come to author this type of book? I think, from what I've read, you have quite an eclectic background. So I'd love to hear from you on that.
Well, thank you for having me on the show, Haley. It's a pleasure to be here. So what I do now, I call being a holistic sexuality teacher. And you might not have heard of one of those before because I made that up. There just really wasn't anything that described what I do, which is predominantly adult sex education. Now, before that, I did have titles that describe what I did. So I've actually been doing this now for almost 19 years. Before that, I was a certified nurse midwife, gynecology practitioner, registered nurse, licensed massage therapist, and childbirth educator. And so for 20-something years, my life really was focused on empowering women around birth and how to have amazing, awesome births, and also women's health. And I loved my work, and it was my calling, and it was my passion. But I now look at it as my work in birth was my 25-year apprenticeship for becoming an amazing sexuality teacher. And, that's confusing to a lot of people because they don't really see the connections between birth and sex. I teach whole classes on this topic because actually it's pretty much all the same equipment, the same biochemical state, the same spiritual journey. I mean, there's just, obviously it's sex that gets babies started, but the whole experience of pregnancy and birth and breastfeeding are also part of a woman's sexual experience. And so anyway, I just learned all kinds of amazing, awesome things from all of that work. And now, if you ask me what I was most proud of, I would say it is that book, Women's Anatomy of Arousal, which is information that I discovered after I had all that education. I was already working. I was doing home birth as a nurse midwife. And I thought I knew everything there was to know about female genitalia and reproductive equipment. And so I was shocked to discover there were parts I had never heard of. And once I found that out, I went on what I now call the hunt for buried pleasure, which was finding all the parts that are missing from our textbooks and our training of medical and sexual health professionals and educators. And the general public, what's missing from our map? What do we not know is there? And helping people find out so that someday it won't be a secret anymore. Everyone will know. That's my mission.
There were still parts that I learned about reading your book, which always ticks me off. I started being ticked off about this in a college BYU class when they taught me several things I didn't know about my body. And I was like, why am I, like 20 years old and I don't even know this about my body, my own body? But that grumpiness has, continued throughout my life as I continue to learn more and more. And even as a certified sex therapist, right? So there were a few body parts I was like, I haven't heard that name before. So yeah.
I'm with you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm with you on those feelings also.
Yes.
Of frustration and anger. And also, I don't know if we'll talk about it today, but in my book, I kind of talk a little bit about why it is. How is it that this information is missing? Because the truth is, everything I talk about was discovered somewhere along the line.
Right.
And then it vanished. It went away.
Right. Yeah, you do an excellent job talking about kind of a lot of the history that we deal with as a human race with sexuality, both from a cultural perspective, informational perspective. I'm not going to focus as much on that today because I've focused on that before, and I really want to get to the anatomy pieces that you speak so well about. But before we do that, the fact that you call yourself a holistic sexual educator, I did want to talk about that because you do talk about holistic sexuality throughout the entire book. And I can just tell you take this approach where it's really a relational approach, a spiritual approach, kind of just everything about your life approach. So I'm going to read these 5 basic principles that you shared and then maybe have you talk a little bit about why this is so important to you. But you say holistic sexuality is first and foremost about your connection with yourself, which I think that's a fabulous concept. Sex is about all the ways we connect with everyone and everything. We're on a lifelong journey of learning and discovery. Sexual and relationship skills can and need to be learned, and learning depends on accurate, useful models. So those are your principles for holistic sexualty.
I'm still with that. I wrote that almost 10 years ago, and I've been teaching about that for longer. But that hasn't changed. I mean, we tend to think of sex as an activity that we do with another person behind a locked bedroom door, as if it's this separate thing. But the truth is, we are sexual beings. We are sexual beings from the moment we're born until the moment we die. It's part of who we are, and it's not separate from all the other ways we live our lives and all the other things we do. And all our other relationships and connections are based on that foundational relationship we have with ourselves. And so that includes how we feel about our body and how we feel about our genitals. It includes things like our experiences, like how our diaper changes were handled when we were a baby, the messages we got from our caretakers about the sovereignty of our body or our internal authority about what gives us pleasure or even if we're hungry or not. Things like when you tell a kid to eat all the food on their plate instead of saying, check in with yourself, check in with your tummy, are you still hungry? So all of the messages we've gotten about gender roles, how men are supposed to be, how women should be, what we can and can't do, what we shouldn't do. All of those things are part of our sexuality. It's not just the direct messages about sex. So I think it's connected to everything. And I think part of having a healing around any trauma or negative messages that we got around our sexuality is understanding that connection and that it's part of that. And that's also part of if we want to have the most beautiful, pleasurable, awesome sex possible. And why wouldn't we want that, right? We're here in this body for this lifetime, and we have this amazing ability to access pleasure and joy with ourselves, create intimacy with partners. Why wouldn't we want to, have the full use of that gift? And we can. But it often involves looking at all of those things that I was just talking about.
Right. And I loved that. And right off the bat, I will say that you talk a lot about self-exploration, which, oftentimes the word we use for that is masturbation, but not necessarily, because you're not just talking about masturbating from the perspective of having an orgasm or self-pleasuring in that way. I mean, that's definitely a part of it, but you're also inviting women in particular to really have tactile information about themselves, so to kind of explore themselves. You have a great, mirror image or mirror exercise in the book as far as how to look at yourself. And, and you really throughout the book have lots of tips about how to understand your own anatomy, which means, actually looking at yourself or taking your hands to yourself. So that's something that anytime I talk about that, just because I know that we're looking at, Mormon audience here, I know it's a little bit controversial for depending on where you're at in Mormonism. I've worked with hundreds, if not thousands of Mormons throughout my career. And I know that the spectrum is wide on this. There's many Mormons who really think touching themselves is fine and have no issues with that. There's lots of Mormons who think that's sinful behavior. Some Mormons think it depends on whether or not you're married. So if you're married and your spouse is okay with it, then it's fine. If you're not married, it's not okay. So I just want to say I'm not here to change anybody's mind about their values, but I just want to honor that people are on different spectrums of their values in regards to touch of self. But we will be talking about that on this program, and we'll be talking about that with Sheri, because she has some really good pointers and ideas and thoughts as to why self-knowledge is so important in the relational context of sexuality when you're sharing yourself with somebody else and trying to understand, how to clue them into your pleasure points and what feels good. And we know through a lot of research that when sex feels good and when both people are, somewhat sexually content and satisfied, that does create a very bonding, strengthening union between them, which, I think most Mormons are definitely about that. So we want to definitely help people have good sexual experiences in marriage. And the reality, and this is why the history part is so important in her book, is that women in particular have not been taught how to access that aspect of themselves, even though it's something that most of us definitely have potential to access. So anything you want to say in regards to my little disclosure here?
Lots actually.
Yeah.
So the first thing is I don't use the word masturbation because I know it's kind of a yucky word, but the Latin actually means to pollute with your hand.
Yeah, I saw that in your book, and I'm like,
right.
Darn it, because I always try to use the word masturbation just to normalize it, but then I'm like, well, I don't like that.
Well, so the word I use is solo sex because, again, it's about your relationship with yourself. And so solo sex can be a real reframing. It's a important, I think, component of our learning journey because it's like playing a musical instrument. And if from the beginning of playing an instrument, all you ever do is play duets, you're never really going to master your instrument. You're not going to be as good at playing duets. So if you want to play great duets with your partner, right, and that marital sexual union can be so incredibly bonding and connecting and just it's, I think, such an important key part of marriage. How are you going to do that if you don't know how to play solo? And so learning and discovering what works for you then enables you to be a wonderful teacher to your partner. He doesn't know how female sexuality operates. He doesn't have that equipment. And so if you start thinking about it that way, it's like, how do you, it's not fair to expect a man to understand how to give a woman pleasure. It's not really his job to give us orgasms. We have to access them within ourselves. And so if I go into my learning laboratory by myself or my practice hall, my rehearsal space, also think of it as my self-care and self-nurturing spa, but that's what solo sex is. So we go in there, we learn, we experience, we go into our solo space to do all of that learning and playing and exploring, and then we bring that knowledge and information out and we can use that with our partner so that we can have that really sacred experience of partner sex, because otherwise we're usually just, we're frustrated, we're unhappy, we're not getting the arousal we want, we're not having the orgasms, we don't feel good about it. Our partner doesn't feel good, right? He wants us to have the pleasure, and he wants to feel like he's enhancing that, and we both want to be able to approach our sexual union with joy and satisfaction and fun and all those things. So it actually, there's so many different ways that the solo sex is important to have that happen. So I just think the spiritual or religious prohibitions around that are some very old ways that kind of got folded in, that are extremely disempowering to female sexuality. And so I do encourage people, if it's within their values and their framework, to explore their solo sex. If it's really, really not, then bring that exploration to your partner sex. Right? If you absolutely feel like that is not okay, I'm not suggesting that you go against your values, but then say to your partner, I want to learn how I operate. I want to learn how to play my own instrument. Can we do that together? Where we do have some times in sessions that the man is there in that supporting role, and the woman is doing what she might normally be doing in my own experience, or in someone who doesn't have that prohibition by herself. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. And you give tips on that as well, on how to do many of these exercises that you're sharing as a couple or by yourself. So that's throughout the book as well.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, and also just to throw out there, we're definitely kind of talking in heteronormative language here. You know, we're talking about kind of heterosexual marriage. Some of these things that we're going to talk about, though, can relate to anybody who is born with female genitalia. So just to kind of understand the language that we're using. So I like to...
thank you for that. I just want to mention that, and for most audiences, I don't use such heteronormative language.
Yes, right.
And I'm sort of figuring that I'm gearing this towards that community.
Yes, right.
But I don't actually know. I don't know.
Well, and I just want to remind people, because I know we have people who listen who are LGBTQ, and I just understand that most of the time we are talking to from a heteronormative perspective, because Mormonism is so fraught with issues in regards to that topic and of itself. But I always just like to say that to help, if anyone is listening from other perspectives, that at least I'm cognizant of that. And I would love for it to be different in some ways, but I'm trying to make it also palatable to the biggest audience as possible. So that's just kind of the reality of where we are in Mormonism right now. All right. So let's dive into women's anatomy. This was my favorite part of the book, although there's lots of parts. So, you know, there's all kinds of stuff you talk about. Like I said, history, energy, go into energy and chakras and all kind of like Eastern philosophies on things like that. Super fascinating. So please get this book and dive in. There's so much to learn. But I'd like to really focus more than anything on the anatomical parts that you did such a great job explaining. So I think we can... I'd like to let you obviously have the lead in this, but I thought about starting kind of with some of the advice you give to people approaching women. So, you know, you kind of have this map for partners, and they start with the, you know, kind of the outermost zone, right? Which is your larger connection, which is just, I think, what you're talking about, energy fields and kind of being in a good space with your partner. And then you talk about the non-erogenous areas of her body, like shoulders and calves and arms, you know, so how do you stroke and start massaging or start touching each other in ways like that? And then the non-genital erogenous zones, like lips, mouth, ears, neck. Then we start, you know, the genital vicinity, like the thighs, the butt, hips, lower back. Then you call it the yard, which is this kind of fun. So the yard being the vulva, the mons, and outer lips of the vulva. And then you call the porch, which is the vestibule. And this consists of the soft, wet middle areas, specifically her inner labia, her clitoris, and the delicate areas around the vaginal and anal openings. And then you say the last is her inner sanctums inside the vagina and anus. So these are all kind of, you know, the map of the body and very kind of overview. And so I'd like to start maybe with the yard, kind of like your ideas about those parts and what roles they play. And right off the bat, maybe what I'm going to say as far as setting up this conversation is one of the points that you make is that genital intercourse for women oftentimes happens way before she is ready to be penetrated. And we also know that penetration is not necessarily the best and most reliable way for female orgasm anyway, but that tends to be a very common issue. And you mentioned something along the lines of, if a man notices that his wife is lubricated or his girlfriend or whatever, that seems to be like, oh, that's the sign. That means that she's ready for penetration, that she's quote unquote wet. And that's not at all how you are posing this entire kind of arousal, format for women. So I'd like to just kind of let you get started as far as explaining how do we get from A to B and C and D and E.
Or A to O.
Right. Yeah, A to O. That's right.
So I love that you pointed out that idea that we really need to go from the outside and slowly and progressively kind of work our way in. And that if we understand female arousal or how it usually operates, it will be very helpful in our sexual experiences, because for many women, we've only been taught or shown a model of arousal that tends to be what works for men. And for many men, arousal begins as a genital experience. Mentally, your mental genitals are your actual genitals, but it starts with those sex centers and then spreads out. And for most women, it goes from the out to in. But if the only model I have is of male arousal, then as a woman, I'm going to think I should be ready for intercourse quickly. And intercourse should be the best thing of all. I still remember the first time I had it, afterwards thinking that was it.
That's a very common quote I hear.
Right? That was it. That wasn't the best thing so far. No. So if we understand, for most women, just even as a time frame, most women, it's going to take us 30 to 45 minutes before our whole body is turned on and our genitals are adequately engorged and turned on. And we need both of those things. So on average, for most people in the United States, the whole sexual encounter from beginning to end lasts about 12 to 15 minutes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so if you look at those numbers, no wonder women are not getting adequately aroused and they're not likely to have orgasms from that. So just starting with understanding that you want to turn on the mind, turn on the whole body, and then focus on turning on the genitals, suddenly that's going to put you at least in that 30 to 45 minute time range. And then it's, by the way, it's not a job or a chore. It's all fun. It's all pleasure. And we want to play with the journey, enjoy the journey, not about the destination. So just reframing the whole experience, I think, is helpful. Then, once we do get to the genitals, and that is when the woman feels ready to have genital contact. And I'm going to throw in one more little map and model that I like to use, which is that of pussycats and puppy dogs.
Mm-hmm.
And so for many men, sexuality is more like a puppy dog.
Mm-hmm.
And so for most dogs, you can meet them and 30 seconds later, they'll be down on the floor and you're rubbing their belly. Right? Like, rub it, please, right? Generally speaking. Most kitty cats, if you want to rub their belly, you got to go through this whole little cat seduction process, where you get their attention and then you demonstrate that you're safe and you go at their pace, and then you start petting them more, stroking their back and then rubbing their ears and then maybe under their chin. And once they feel safe and they know you can give them pleasure and they trust you, sooner or later you can get to the tummy and you can rub that nice furry belly of theirs.
Right.
But you got to get there. You just don't go there first. And women tend to be very much like pussycats in this sense. So once your pussycat or the female person is in that relaxed, safe, pleasured space, then she's going to be ready to have her genitals touched. And then even then we want to start, we don't really want to just dive into them ever. We always want to approach like by stroking up the thigh and then maybe just across the genitals with lots of kind of teasing, general, big, inclusive kind of strokes and touches and movements. And basically, you know, it's time to touch her genitals when she's almost begging you to, right? When she's like, please, like now, right? Then you know she's really ready. The wetness, forget that. That's such an early arousal sign. You shouldn't even be able to know that because you shouldn't even be there until she's already saying, please, like really, like now, like get there already, right? So the more you take your time, the more you build up that arousal energy, the more pleasurable it's going to be for her when you get there. And then when you get to the genitals, again, you start on the outside of the vulva. You start on the outer labia. You start on the mons. And again, you just like a pussycat, you wait for those signals that she's ready for more direct stimulation. And in fact, one of the areas that I talk about that isn't really known about is a good first area to really start stimulating. So underneath the labia, we have what I call the vestibular bulbs. I didn't name them that, other people. But those were the first part that I discovered from a book that I had no idea existed. Remember, I'm already a certified nurse midwife, gynecology practitioner. I mean, I've studied anatomy, female genital anatomy in depth multiple times. And I read this book that talks about the vestibular bulbs. It's two big wads of erectile tissue, one underneath each of the labia. And I still remember reading that book going, what? I have what? I've never heard of this. This is crazy. Now, I have no prohibitions at all from my spiritual tradition about self-pleasure, of self-exploration. So I immediately went and looked in the mirror and felt around and played with myself. And sure enough, these big wads of erectile tissue puff up under the labia. They get huge. They're so obvious once you find them. You're basically, how did I miss this? How did I not know these were here?
And just to interrupt you just really quickly, because you're using the word erectile. So it is important to know that, you know, I guess when we're fetuses, right, we all kind of start out with the same equipment. And then depending on your DNA and whether you have a Y or X chromosome, that starts developing in different ways. But we all have, and you say this in your book, the same amount of erectile tissue that is expanding through arousal. So just like the man has the penis that's, you know, can get quite big.
It's obvious. So we see that.
Yeah, right. We have just as much of that happening mostly internally. The clitoris and the labia do enlarge as well, but mostly internally, those things are also enlarging. So yeah, please go ahead. Sorry to.
Well, I'll just add. So erectile tissue has that ability to go from small and soft to big and hard. It fills up with blood, becomes more sensitive. And I'll just emphasize what you said. Men and women have the same amount of engorgeable, expandable erectile tissue. It's just arranged differently. And this is what we didn't know, and I didn't know.
And I didn't know this completely. I didn't know that we had the same amount until I read your book. I knew we had erectile tissue. But
right.
Yeah.
Right. But I had been taught, well, we had a clitoris, and that was our erectile tissue. And you compare them, you know, we have this little structure and male bodies have this big structure. And it seems like, well, they got a lot more than we did. But no, we all have the same amount. It's just arranged differently. Theirs is quite obvious, and ours is not so obvious. So we have what I call an erectile network, a whole network of structures made out of erectile tissue that include the vestibular bulbs, the three parts of the clitoris. I didn't, for a long time, I didn't even know there were three parts to the clitoris, as well as two more internal erectile structures. And when you put all of that together, that's the equivalent of a penis's worth of erectile tissue. And I think the other thing that's useful to know, well, two more things actually that are useful to know. One is that when all of those structures are engorged, they work together. They form this interconnected unit of pleasure. And that's actually how our bodies are designed, right? And if you believe they're designed by God, God gave us that.
Right.
that
Right.
wonderful network of pleasure that we have. Very brilliant designer who
Mm-hmm.
right,
Mm-hmm.
figured out all this stuff. It's also part of why our vaginas can expand enough to get babies out, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
Just saying there's all this
And
connections.
contract enough, like you said,
Uh-huh.
to make it comfortable for whatever penis size you might be engaging
Mm,
with, which is
that's right.
also another misnomer, is that penis size
Mhm.
matters so much, right? But
Yeah,
your
it
vagina
doesn't matter.
adjusts to whatever it
Yes,
is that you're dealing with.
exactly. Babies,
I love our
penises,
vaginas.
vaginas can do it all. They're
They're
really
amazing.
amazing. They are so amazing. So, so we have all that erectile tissue. The other thing that I think is important to know, though, is that women can get aroused and have orgasms with just part of that network activated. And so for most of us, certainly for me before I figured this out, and many of the women I've worked with, it's like we've been working with part of the equipment, but not the whole network. It's sort of like playing the piano and thinking you have 22 keys on your piano. You can still make beautiful music with just those keys. But when you realize you've got 88 keys and foot pedals, the music that you can make expands dramatically.
Right.
So this is about learning where all our equipment is and knowing that when we do get the whole set of equipment working together, it profoundly expands how much pleasure we can have. It's pretty dramatic. And in fact, if we do want to be able to learn how to have orgasms from intercourse, which is a learnable skill,
Mm-hmm.
we can learn it. Most of us don't start out automatically doing that, but we can learn how. One of the keys is making sure that you've gotten that whole arousal system working for you before you have penetration,
Mm-hmm.
as well as making sure your whole mind and
Mm-hmm.
whole body are really aroused and turned on. You get those things, you get the whole mind body arousal and genital engorgement together, intercourse becomes much more pleasurable and much more likely to be orgasmic, which is a
Right.
fun thing to learn.
Right, right. And I think, you often hear people saying, oh, there's a vaginal orgasm, or there's a clitoral orgasm, or there's a G-spot orgasm. And I think the point is, look, these nerves are all in there, and specifically within the clitoral and these vestibular bulbs that you're talking about. And so it's not that it's any one part necessarily that's giving you the orgasm. It's that entire centric zone that's getting stimulated. And if you're arousing all the different parts, and especially the clitoral areas where there's so many nerves specifically in that area, then that's what's offering orgasm. It's not so much that, would you agree with how I'm saying that, or would you say that differently?
Well, I would say it a little differently. I think we have multiple pathways through the different major nerves that go to different parts of our genitals. And so if we're stimulating structures that are primarily innervated by a single major nerve, so example would be clitoral stimulation. We're stimulating that major one single nerve pathway, that more external nerve pathway. And that can be fantastic. Make it even better, stimulate the other nerve pathways as well. And so we have major nerve pathways that innervate the more internal structures. So that would be the two pieces of erectile tissue. Inside, we haven't talked about those yet, but there's a erectile tissue that surrounds the urethra. There's erectile tissue in the floor under the perineum. And there's also the uterus, which is a player in arousal and orgasm, despite what we've been told that it isn't. It is. There are the deep layers of the pelvic floor muscles are part of that innervation pathway. The deep anal structures are part of that. And so when we get kind of both of the major pathways stimulated, and while we're at it, there's a third major pathway, which is more of a whole body pathway.
Mm-hmm.
So we have the vagus nerve pathway, which is connected to every system in our body. So when we're using tools like breath and sound and whole body movement, when our emotions are engaged, that's using that third major pathway.
Mm-hmm.
When we get all three of those pathways firing, that's when we get the most ecstatic experiences.
And you even mentioned several times the strategy or tip of just even opening your mouth as a form of relaxing and engaging other parts of your body. Is that fair?
Well, the mouth and the genitals are hardwired together. So if we want our genitals to get aroused and expand and open and relax, we can do the same with our mouth. So I wouldn't say open as much as relaxed open.
Mm-hmm.
Not like going to the dentist open.
Right, right. That doesn't sound very arousing.
No, but I'll tell you, this goes back to my midwife days, but when I first discovered that connection, which is that if you're in labor and you would like to get your baby out, and generally when we're in labor, we'd rather get them out sooner than later, right? One of the most important things to do is relax and open your mouth and throat. And when you do that, your whole bottom relaxes and opens. And so that's when I first learned about that connection. You know, and a lot of these connections I learned about as a midwife. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I was unconsciously using them in the sex I was having with my husband. And I did not even know I was using those things. Mm-hmm. Right? I'd learned about breath and sound and relaxing. I'd learned all that, and I was teaching my women that in my childbirth classes. And it was 10 years before I realized I was incorporating all of that stuff, and that was why my sexual life had gotten better and better and easier and bigger and all the good things. Yeah.
So give us an overview then of all the erectile tissue.
Okay, so the erectile tissue. Well, first of all, I'll just mention we have erectile tissue in other parts of our body than our genitals. Nipples, obviously, they become erect. We have it in our lips. We have it in the sides of our nose and our earlobes. I also have a theory, no data to prove it. I think we have erectile tissue inside our mouth, especially deep inside of our mouth and throat, which also become engorged. And we know that because when we become aroused, our voice tends to drop and get sexy. That's because our vocal cords are actually becoming somewhat engorged. Then moving down to the genitals, we have this network of structures. We can start with the jewel in the crown, the head of the clitoris, the part that most of us are familiar with, which we only got back, by the way, in the cultural consciousness about, not even 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Right? Really in the 70s. And
we still don't teach it. And
we still, that's a whole nother story. But
yes.
Right, at least it got into the books.
Yes, right.
Starting then. Okay, so the head of the clitoris, which is only one part of the clitoris, and that is the most highly innervated, most sensitive structure in the male and or female body. And so, like I say, the jewel in the crown. Then the clitoris has a shaft, which is underneath the hood, and then it splits in two like a fat wishbone and has two legs. They're about 3 or 4 inches long, and they actually run along the bone of the pubic arch. So those are the 3 parts of the clitoris. Then we have the vestibular bulbs, which I mentioned before, which are these 2 big wads of erectile tissue under the labia, and they're shaped like an upside-down comma. So they're fat at the bottom, which is the part that's right on either side of the vaginal opening. They're sort of like they're cupping the vaginal opening at the bottom. And then the top of them actually connects to the shaft of the clitoris. Interesting, right? They're actually connected.
Yes.
Right? But again, if we don't play with them, they won't get big and engorged. And if they don't get big and engorged, then the sensations around the vaginal opening don't get transmitted up to the clitoral structures as well. Multiple reasons. And of course, when they're engorged,
intercourse painful or at best just kind of neutral.
Yeah, not so great. But when they are big and engorged, then anything that's stimulating that entrance to the vagina is going to be stimulating the bulbs. And as I mentioned, they can be stimulated from the outside of the labia.
Right.
So that's a wonderful place to start genital stimulation with the bulbs.
Right.
From the outside of the labia.
And not because the clitoris has gotten a lot of attention. And I always remind men, do not just go directly to the clitoris because, like you said, it's the most sensitive area. And you talk a lot about this where it can be almost irritating or unpleasurable if you just directly go right to, think about, somebody just touching your nipple when it's not erect, right? Or when it's not aroused, and it can be irritating and not so fun.
The clitoris is very tricky because there can be easily too much stimulation, or there could be too little stimulation.
Mm-hmm.
And that is actually going to change during arousal. The more aroused we are, the more stimulation it can take.
Exactly. Right.
So this is why feedback and communication with a partner are so important, because they often need to know right now a little less stimulation or more diffuse stimulation, broader and less pointy, or now I really want you to bring it on.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Mm-hmm. And rhythmic stimulation. The clitoris loves rhythmic stimulation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's another thing. So sometimes partners are doing something that feels really good with a nice rhythm, and then we're liking it, so they think, I'll do it harder or I'll do it faster. It's like, no, that was perfect. Like, stay right there.
Stay right there until I ask you to do it faster or harder.
So it's very tricky. Anyway, but back to the whole erectile network. Okay, so we've got the 3 clitoral structures. We've got the vestibular bulbs, and those are all somewhat more external. We can access all that from the outside of the body. The other 2 erectile structures are more internal. So we have what I'm using the term that was developed by the people who wrote the book that actually got me started on this new view of a woman's body. And they call it the urethral sponge. It's a spongy erectile tissue that forms a tube around the tube of the urethra. Mm-hmm. That's your pee tube that goes from your bladder to your pee hole, basically. Mm-hmm. And so this is just above the roof of the vagina. You could also envision it like a roll of paper towels. Mm-hmm. The pee tube, the urethra, is the cardboard inside the roll, and the erectile tissue is the paper towels. Mm-hmm. Now, when it is not stimulated and it's not engorged, it's kind of like you're near the end of the roll of paper towels. Mm-hmm. When it is properly stimulated and engorged, it's like a brand new jumbo roll of paper towels, and it becomes quite obvious that it's there. Last but not least, there's erectile tissue in the floor of the vagina, and that's in the wall between the vaginal and anal canals. Now, that one's in deeper. That one's in inch and a half inside the body. Because Mother Nature, she wants to protect that during childbirth. Doesn't want that ripping. Mm-hmm. So you put that all together, and when all of those structures, like I said, are really engorged, you get this basically this cuff, this stretchy, fat, juicy cuff of erectile tissue that's all working together and connected and feeling really good.
Now, there is a connection, I believe, if I read this right in your book, the G-spot, in a sense, is the urethral erectile tissue that's you're feeling from the other side of the vaginal wall.
Yes.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the G-spot, which was discovered by Dr. Grafenberg, not true, of course, because lots of people already knew it was there,
right?
And then became named after him. And he doesn't even have one. He also describes it incorrectly. He describes it as a round dime-sized spot above the roof of the vagina. What people are referring to is actually the bottom of the urethral sponge. You remember, if you envision the little roll of paper towels in there, you can feel the length of it. You can, if you put your fingers inside the vagina, you can feel kind of almost like the gutters on either side of that roll. And in fact, you actually can see from the outside, because remember, it surrounds the urethral opening. So this is why looking is so cool. When it's really engorged and you look from the outside, you can see like a raised stage almost, like the end of the roll of paper towels, basically, around the urethral opening. So you know that's the shape of it, because you can see the end of it and play with it also from the outside around the urethral opening. By the way, I don't advise playing there until it's engorged. Otherwise, it's just irritating. It causes to get infections. And you can feel the bottom and part of the sides of it. So you can't feel the top. You'd have to slice open your belly. You can't get that part, but you can feel the bottom part of the sides, and you can see the end. And so that's how you know what it is and where it is.
Right. And so then when people are thinking, oh, the G-spot is the amazing orgasm. What's really happening there is that you're stimulating this erectile tissue, and to your point before, that stimulates different nerves, which then stimulate even more nerves, which then can lead to a different type of quality of orgasm, which is there are all different kinds of orgasm, from in the sense of how long they might last, how intense they feel, how you would describe them. And this is because there are so many body parts and so many different nerves, and so there are different types.
Yeah, where it feels centered in your body and so forth. I will say the urethral sponge is innervated by both that more external nerve pathway and the more internal one. So it's like a bridge between those two nerve pathways. I'll also add, some people think the G-spot is some kind of magic button. You just like push it and like a doorbell ringing and you get an orgasm. And that's not how it happens. Not how it works at all. In fact, you shouldn't even be stimulating that internal more inner erectile structures until the woman is at high level arousal, full body mind arousal and full engorgement of the more external parts.
Right.
And at that point, then when you go in, it's going to be appropriate to do stimulation. And I will say the best tool for that job of stimulating the urethral sponge and the perineal sponge is actually not necessarily a penis. Fingers are really perfect for that job. And then after lots of stimulation with fingers, the roof and the floor, at that point, that might be the perfect time to be penetrating with something more substantial like a penis or a sex toy of some kind.
So let's jump right into anal play, because this is a huge taboo. People oftentimes have all kinds of ideas. I mean, if we have negative ideas about our genitals because it's dirty or gross or yuck, we definitely, I think, have that idea about our anus. And you talk a lot about how the anus has been given a bad rap, and it's kind of sad and lonely. And it's because it gets oftentimes ignored. And yet we do know that both for the men, because you're stimulating kind of the prostate gland, and for the women, you're stimulating this erectile tissue that you're talking about, which is similar to, it's kind of the equivalent of the prostate. It can be very pleasurable. And so do you want to talk a little bit about how do we get over our hangups around the anus?
Sure. So I will say that just in terms of pleasure potential, our genitals are number one on the hit parade. They've got the most nerve endings. Number two on the hit parade is the anus and the anal areas. So there's a lot of pleasure potential there. And yes, we do have big hang-ups around it. And the first thing I would say is we do need to be thoughtful about the bacteria that lives in the anus. This is not bacteria that we want in our vaginas, in our urethra, or in our mouth. So keeping that in mind, if you are doing anal play, you want to practice really good sexual hygiene, which means anything that goes in or near the anus or anal opening is segregated. So that might be right hand, left hand, right hand's vaginal, left hand is for the butt. You could do it that way. The easiest way to do it is to actually use a glove, like a latex or nitrile glove, like you would get from it when you were getting a medical exam. You can buy a box of them, and that way if you're doing anal play, you put on a glove, you do your anal play. When you're done, you take the glove off. If you're having anal penetration with a sex toy or a penis, put a condom on it. And then when you're done, take the condom off. So there's some very simple things we can do to make sure that the bacteria that live in our butts, that belong there, stay there. That being said, another way of thinking about anal pleasure is to start with your solo explorations, if that's something that's okay with you, rather than having somebody else going in, that when you're pleasuring yourself, again, using one hand or a toy, ideally with you could certainly put a glove or a condom on it to have that bacteria taken care of, and just start touching just around the opening with some lube and notice how it feels. And if it feels good, then at some point you put in just the tip of a finger and you notice how that feels. And if these sensations are pleasurable to you, you continue to explore. And then once you're comfortable doing that on your own, then is an appropriate time to introduce it with a partner. And remember that entering an anus requires a degree of gentleness, lubrication, and slowness that is much more so even than a vagina. I mean, vaginas, it's nice to enter them slowly and with lubrication and with great awareness as well, but even more so with an anus. Mm-hmm. And it's all based on the pleasure of the anus owners, not the penetrators. And everyone has one. So that's another wonderful way we can bring that to partner play. In fact, if you have a male partner, some sort of anal penetration and anal play can help him actually understand what it feels like to be penetrated, mm-hmm. and might help him learn something about how he might want to penetrate a vagina or an anus as well. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then I think the last thing I would say about anal pleasure is the higher your level of arousal, the more likely it is going to be to feel good.
Right.
So you don't want to do that early on in arousal. That'd be like trying to rub the kitty's tummy, before the cat's all relaxed and safe and relaxed and open, and even more so than the vagina. So anuses are you have to seduce them.
Yep. Yeah, for sure.
You can't just go barging in there. You really have to seduce them. And so it can be really a fun, pleasurable way to expand our repertoire of what's possible.
Right. And to your point too, the anus itself is not holding feces. That's the body part above that. And so just to make sure that people aren't concerned about things that are actually not true.
Right. Now, there might be some traces, which is why the glove is good, and having some baby wipes, especially the natural ones I go for because I'm a natural person, but mm-hmm. some natural baby wipes by the bed is good in case there is a little bit more than you thought there was of traces of poop, because that can happen. But generally our poop is held in the rectum, which is above there, and it doesn't come down until we get that sensation.
Right.
It says, I need to poop now, right?
Right,
and then
right.
Go do that. But yeah, so, you could put a pad down on the bed. You can have gloves. You can have some wet wipes. So you can prepare your space the same way you might, we haven't talked about it, but for women who are ejaculators, who female ejaculate or want to learn how, you prepare your space. You get your waterproof pads. You drink lots of water. Things you do to contain mess, and also to facilitate the kinds of experiences you want to learn how to have.
Yeah. So let's maybe end on that note. I mean, there is so much more in this book. You talk about hymen mythology, which I've talked a little bit about before, but I think it's always just really good to repeat that. You talk about female ejaculate. You have lots of tips for partners of women, so men in particular, and you even have a chapter at the end specifically for men. So there's just
a very short chapter.
Short chapter, but I think
for men.
Yeah, I think a good, informative chapter that, if you want to just get to the good stuff before you read the entire book. I still recommend reading the entire book, but it's a good chapter just to kind of understand some of these principles that we've been talking about. I think what is most fascinating about the language that you use, and I think very empowering, is this idea that we can learn how to develop these skills. So many times in my office, particularly before I became a sex therapist, but even as a sex therapist, sometimes it can be frustrating or sad to hear, women in particular coming in and saying, I tried the exercise you gave me. I really don't think I can do this. I think that there's a lot of angst and a lot of maybe even cultural anxiety around female pleasure. And sometimes it feels more like work than play, like you're saying, right? So I have to figure this out, so that my partner can be happy with me. And so I just see a lot of sadness and a lot of even wondering, is this effort worth it? Why should I try to want, because then it feels more like work, and then it feels more male-centric, like it's more about my partner than me. So what are your thoughts about just kind of this overall kind of message as far as why is it worth putting some time and energy learning about ourselves, how do we frame that in ways that are not male-centric, that are more like, are self-centric? And why is it worth it to try to learn these things and not get discouraged along the way if you hit a few hurdles?
Well, I think that the first thing I would say is that nobody is broken. And so that if you're feeling broken, you're not broken. There's just things you haven't learned yet. And learning is a process. Just like if you wanted to learn how to play the piano and you knew nothing about music, you wouldn't expect to learn it in a day or a week or by doing one practice exercise or session. It's something that you're going to learn over time. It's like learning a language. So it's a whole skill set. And the thing with learning complex skills is if we start with simple skills, then we get okay at that one, and then we go for a slightly more complex skill, and then we combine skills and we layer that. And after a while, you speak French or play the piano or whatever it is you wanted to learn. So I think it's important to have patience in this process. The other thing is about focusing on pleasure. This is about pleasure. So if something feels like work to you, first thing would is reframe that. This is about pleasure. This is about self-care, the same way we might meditate or exercise or pray or go work in the garden, whatever it is that we do to take care of ourselves. This is self-care. This is healing. There's a healing quality to this. I think almost all of us walk around with some sort of psychological damage around our sexuality just from living in the cultures and the world we live in. We may have had specific experiences that were traumatic. So giving ourselves time to do self-loving, self-healing, nurturing, therapeutic pleasure is key. And we might need to really reframe that. We might think, oh, pleasure's indulgent. It's selfish, right? So might even start with just sort of noticing what comes up for you around the idea of pleasure, and start to frame it as a positive thing. This is the way I take care of myself. Pleasure is good. Pleasure is one of those sacred gifts we were given. And if we're not having that pleasure, we're not happy, and no one around us is happy. Mama ain't happy, nobody's happy.
Right.
Right? So this is actually a way of taking care of yourself, your partner, your family. In fact, arousal and orgasm are antidepressants, and they decrease anxiety, and they're good for our blood pressure, and they're good for our cardiovascular system. I mean,
so many benefits.
Right, every single benefit we could get from aerobic exercise, meditation, eating healthy, all of the things that we know we should be doing, we could get all of that from sexual pleasure. And besides, it's not fattening.
Yeah. In fact, you might burn some calories.
It doesn't cost anything, right? I mean, so to me, this is like the win-win-win. So starting with that mental, really, because it starts here in the mind with that mental reframing. I would encourage people who maybe have conflicts around the religious issues to actually maybe consider seeing this as part of your spiritual practice. This is a way to get next to God, right? I mean, this is the way to connect directly with your divine deity, however you perceive that. And I think that that's an important reframe for people who have gotten the message from their religion that this is negative and bad, to maybe look at that message and go, no, this God gave me this.
Yeah.
As a way to connect to Him.
Mormon validate what you're saying.
Okay, thank you.
Because we have a great scripture, and I remind my listeners about this so often. We say men, and I'll add in women, are that they might have joy. And so we actually have very sex positive parts of our doctrine that include the importance of pleasure and joy in our lives. And not that anybody's comfortable talking about this necessarily in Sunday school, but I've said, the female in particular has an entire organ dedicated to really sensation. That's like its only purpose. The clitoris is sensation. And hopefully that's pleasurable sensation, right? And like you said, if you're going to believe in a God, a creator, what an amazing thing to have inserted, into female anatomy. What a message, what a divine message. That it is something that we are to access and learn and play with and have fun with. So I just want to back you up with my Mormon language.
Thank you. I suspected it was in there because every other religion that I've worked with people who are from that religion that has those prohibitions, once you start exploring, the positive messages are there also. Mm-hmm. So we can find them and choose those. So anyway, patience. Do it out of love, do it out of love for yourself, and know that will radiate out to everyone around you and influence others and help others connect to their pleasure and feel good about their body. And if we have children, we want to give them these messages, these body positive messages, this body is a temple and it is sacred, and this is yours, and you get to love it and take care of it and share it appropriately.
Can't thank you enough for your time, Sheri. This was such a wonderful interview, and I really appreciate all of the messages and all of the frameworks and all of the information that you have really compiled in such, I think, a user-friendly way. And I would really recommend your book. It's Women's Anatomy of Arousal, Secret Maps to Buried Pleasure. And it is buried, and it's fun to find. So with that, I would just remind our listeners that you can subscribe, of course, to Mormon Sex Info and have access to all of the different podcasts. Some are shared without cost, and some are. So just please, if you find value in this, please share and talk about these podcasts with others and let others know that it exists. And Sheri, in the meantime, I wish you nothing but the best. And thanks again for your time and coming on.
Well, thank you for having me. And I just mentioned if anyone wants to find lots of free goodies, they can go to my website too at intimateartscenter.com. And there's lots of blog posts and some freebies, and as well as online courses and classes and books and things like that. So there's lots of information they can get for free on my site as well.
Wonderful. We'll definitely link to that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me on. This was really a pleasure, and I felt really a great connection talking to you.
Oh, wonderful. So, me too. I loved having you. Thanks so much. You have a wonderful day, and I hope you get a little bit better. I know you had a little sinus stuff going on. So I just recovered from that, so I wish you the best.
Thank you.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles. And as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
It's been a long road here, a trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary. It's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary.